Hello, everyone. Thanks for hopping across the river and finding time from your busy schedule to join us for BostonCHI event. Also, the weather is nice. My name is Kashram Pyaz. I'm a PhD candidate here at Northeastern. I also chair BostonCHI. Today, we have wonderful speaker Ziv, who will be presenting his talk. Ziv Epstein is postdoc associate at MIT. In his research, he focuses on translating insights from design and social sciences into the development of socio-technical systems such as generative AI and social media platforms. Ziv has published papers in venues such as the general interest journals Nature, Science, as well as top-tier CS conferences like CHI and CSEW. His work has also received widespread media attention in outlets like New York Times, Scientific American, and NPR. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks so much for the warm welcome. It's lovely to hop across the river and to be here presenting some friendly faces. So yeah, I'm very excited to share some of my more recent work on reinventing the attention machine. And so this is kind of exploring how we can design these systems to support and pay attention to people's values. And my slide clicker has a slight delay, so just a heads up. But actually, to start this talk, I want to kind of go back in time a little bit. So this is a building. I don't know if anyone knows which building this is. So this is actually the House of Commons, which is the Parliamentary Hall of the UK. And this building is interesting because it was actually bombed and destroyed during World War II. And in the aftermath of the war, the kind of government had this opportunity to rebuild the Parliamentary Hall and build any building that they absolutely wanted to. However, in this moment, they decided to build the exact same building that was actually already there. And when kind of asked about this kind of puzzle, Winston Churchill famously said, "We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us." Right? This kind of speaks to the fact that a certain political system was enacted by this very kind of tight geometry where there's two sides facing each other. It's very intimate. And ultimately, what this speaks to is how our values shape our buildings, right? There's a certain kind of political system and kind of small, direct debate that they wanted in this space, which in turn, was edified in this way, steering attention, how people are interacting in the space, which in turn shapes behavior. So the reason I'm talking about this is because today we are also in the kind of grand stage of building edifices. But the buildings that we're building are not parliamentary halls per se. They are online buildings, social media, and also generative AI. And with these online buildings, we're seeing kind of tensions of kind of how those values that are represented in the building of those kind of reflect in behavior, right? So with these social media algorithms, like widespread anxieties of how they rule the world and control what we see, and kind of who controls what the algorithm is dictating, right? It's this kind of techno-feudalistic model where there's a few kind of owners of these platforms who unilaterally control the objectives of them, and kind of collect rent on these platforms, which kind of leads to this sentiment of how maybe these algorithms are kind of the first at-scale misaligned AI systems. So in this talk, I'm going to explore a little bit of what are the values that actually shape our online buildings, and how does kind of value-aware design, or the lack thereof, actually impact behavior with these systems. So I want to give you a kind of short guiding example before I dive in to give you a taste of what this research looks like. And the context here is kind of how do we kind of fix or mitigate the algorithmic amplification of misinformation on social media, right? We're seeing this, the proliferation of low quality content. And I think this is a really good kind of guiding example of the kind of misalignments that we see on these platforms. So there's kind of widespread, I don't have to kind of go into too much of this audience about how these algorithms are maximizing engagement. They predict the likelihood you're going to click and then serve you content based on that. And that is kind of problematic for a lot of reasons. In particular, it actually proliferates clickbait and low quality information because that's the kind of content that gets a lot of clicks. So of course, that's the content that the algorithm is going to kind of proliferate. What can we do about this? In a paper published in Science Advances, I actually show that when you ask people if information is true or false, people are actually pretty good at discerning truth from falsehood. But for some reason, it doesn't translate into their sharing judgments. And why might that be the case? So I don't know if you're like me, but when you scroll, social media can look a lot of times like this. It's very distracting. There's lots of FOMO. It's a kind of, designed after the dark patterns of casino-like interfaces that kind of exploit these cognitive biases. You can kind of think of the slot machine, right, of the casino, the bright flashing lights. So this kind of highlights what's at stake, but it also highlights a potential design intervention that could actually work. So the idea is, let's say you're scrolling your distracted feed here, and then you see a kind of sketchy piece of content. And in that moment, what if there was just a little question that was like, hey, how accurate is this? The idea is that then, instead of thinking of social motivations for sharing, such as pleasing friends and followers or signaling group membership, instead, this idea of accuracy, which people are actually good at discerning, is top of mind. And so this is the idea of an accuracy prompt. And in a series of experiments, we've actually shown that just getting people to think about accuracy is actually sufficient to increase sharing discernment, the difference in sharing between true and false, of downstream content once people are kind of put into this mindset. And I think this is a really exciting way to think about misinformation, because it doesn't rely on centralized machine learning algorithms that are dictating what is true and what is false, or armies of content moderators. This really kind of augments and promotes individuals' autonomy by getting people to show up to those core competencies that they have for discernment, and then letting them kind of use that. So this is kind of one idea of how you might align the objectives of a system with users, but ultimately how you actually prove this and measure this is really hard, right? So the first piece is articulating these actual constructs of interest that are rooted in the social science. So there we kind of start by, in a Qualtrics survey environment, actually show that, when you prompt accuracy, it increases the kind of discernment in self-reported accuracy judgments that we've done with large nationally representative samples of Americans. And then once you can demonstrate that, then we're able to kind of expand it to still survey context, but cross-cultural. So we have 16 countries and 6 continents and 9 languages with over 33,000 participants. But ultimately, this is still hypothetical, sharing intention. So to show it actually kind of works ecologically, we turn to the field. And so that demonstrates this kind of technical feasibility. And so there, in a paper published in Nature, we actually show that it works in a digital field experiment where we have a network of bot accounts that are delivering these accuracy prompts to a large number of folks sharing low quality information. And then once you have this kind of field experiment, then the companies have a amount of kind of, okay, this is like a level of evidence that is then kind of interesting for them to adopt. So that in turn then led to engagement from society and platforms, resulting in interest from companies like a collaboration with Google, interest from TikTok, and recently Meta ran a 33 million person RCT that showed significant reduction in misinformation sharing due to these accuracy prompts. Okay, so this is just kind of to illustrate the point that system design in these platforms is really hard and requires a lot of layers of machinery. So in this talk, I'm going to make the point that these existing social algorithms, like these feed algorithms predicting engagement, lack the right signals to give us the information that we actually want. And the problem is that a lot of times these algorithms are learning from human behavior, but people act in complex ways, oftentimes in irrational ways. So the focus here and the kind of promise is, what if we actually kind of try to tell these AI systems what we want explicitly, right? And actually kind of dictate what those values and objectives might be. So this is exciting, especially in the age of large language models, but ultimately there are problems here. For one, values and what we actually want are normatively contested, right? They mean different things to different people. And so if you're going to encode these into algorithms, you need to reckon with the inherent subjectivity of these constructs. So my work in this space that I'll talk about explores measurement infrastructure for subjective labels. And another problem is that even if you can kind of handle this normative contestation, you have to kind of instrument them precisely and build evaluations that are actually useful, which doesn't seem kind of at first obvious how to do so. So this work also, I'll talk about a paper where we explore new objectives for evaluating these social algorithms. And then in the kind of end of the talk, I should say that this kind of fits under this broader vision of reinventing the attention machine, right? Kind of changing the objectives of these algorithms to actually align with users' values. And I'll kind of close with some kind of more recent work that's a little different in style, that's actually trying to explore how to reimagine creative production, not just content consumption, in the age of AI. So those are kind of like the three projects I'll touch on very briefly. Okay, so starting with this kind of first pillar here. So the vision here is to kind of expand a larger set of values and create a design space of values for these algorithms. So I talked about those accuracy prompts as a way to kind of shift behavior, but ultimately that's a patch in an existing engagement maximizing regime, right? The algorithms are still pumping out content that people are clicking on. And so the question is, what is this kind of broader set of values, right? If accuracy is one of them, how do we kind of think about and articulate a broader design space? And I think ultimately this is something that is challenging. Boop. Got a little bit of a... So this one is working, but this one is, maybe I'll just hit stop share and then reshare. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, great. This is promising. Okay, apologies for the delay. Hopefully now this works. Okay, great. So what I was saying is that we need this design space of values. And it's hard because there's a lot of unanswered questions, such as what values are actually, what are we talking about here? How do we handle the subjectivity of values? And also, how do we kind of show that it works in platforms in the same way that I was talking about? So here I'm going to start by talking about values. And when I'm talking about them, I'm going to take a view from cross-cultural psychology here, which posits that values are these guiding principles that transcend specific situations, vary in importance, and are reflected not only in self-reports, but also in behaviors. So the value system that I'll talk about here is called the Schwartz theory of basic human values. Maybe some people in the room are familiar with it. It was developed by a psychologist who essentially asked tens of thousands of students and teachers all over the world these huge, massive questionnaires about their values. And they boiled it down with a lot of different statistics to define these 19 values that kind of hang together and represent this comprehensive set, in their words, of values. And it has these kind of interesting properties where it's a circle. So values that are close to each other are said to be similar, like tradition and societal security. And values that are far away are said to be intention. And it also captures kind of first order differences in values, such as collectivist values, so values about like the community and the group, versus individualistic values that are about yourself and kind of your own individual attainment. So we're gonna just, for the sake of this, start with this value system and see how far we can get with it in the context of social media. So I wanna give you a concrete example of what we're talking about when we talk about values in the context of social media. So this is one of the posts in our data set. Not every disability is visible. And I'm going to flash up 3 of these different Schwartz values. And I'm curious, by show of hands, who here thinks that this post contains that value? Are we ready? Okay, so this first one is universal concern, commitment to equality, justice, and protection for all people. Who here thinks this post contains the value? Okay, great, I'm seeing a lot of hands. Great. What about tradition? Maintaining and preserving cultural, family, or religious tradition? No hands. Okay. What about humility? Recognizing one's insignificance in the larger scheme of things. Few hands, kind of shaky. Great. Okay, fantastic. So what you guys said is nearly identical to what our participants said. So here I'll show you 5 participants and what they rated for this post across those 19 values that I just talked about. And here, what we see is that there's a fair bit of consensus where people are saying this post contains values like universal concern, maybe caring. And similarly, no one said that the post contains the value of tradition. However, when we look at humility, we see a spread, right? Some people says it contains humility and others say it doesn't. And there, it's kind of this question of who's to say who's correct, right? It's kind of in the eye of the beholder a little bit. So that kind of underscores the subjectivity. So here, in the purpose of trying to measure this on social media, we want to try to build a classifier to detect these values. So one thing you might want to do is see how a base LLM, here GPT-4o, with a value codebook and the same Likert scales of raters, does on predicting the values of this. So when you do that, you see that in kind of broad strokes, it's getting some of the things right. You're seeing that it's hitting on universal concern, not on tradition, but you can tell it's not doing a very good job on this kind of hard task. So another thing you could do is actually fine-tune the model on high consensus labels, right? You find posts and values that people really agree on, and then use that for fine-tuning. And here in blue is what happens when you do that. It looks a lot better, right? If you squint, you can kind of see that it's matching the overall distribution a little bit better. But ultimately, the point of the subjectivity is that since people disagree so much with each other, no matter what model you come up with is not going to make everyone happy. So a third thing you could do is actually personalize the prediction. So each value prediction is different for each person. So I'll talk very briefly about how you might do that in this architecture we developed that essentially combines the fine-tuned model I just talked about with some kind of lightweight user calibration. So essentially, we get a dense annotation of annotators who rate a bunch of posts for a bunch of values. Then we essentially take a principal component reduction of this to collapse across the different kinds of values that we see. And that essentially allows us to find certain posts and certain values where those are kind of maximally explaining disagreements between people. So to give you an example, when you do this kind of procedure, you find one post, so such as this, getting the nice plates out for the holiday. And then the response is, to what extent does this post reflect pleasure and sensuous gratification from 1 to 7? And essentially what this means is that this was very controversial. Some people were like, absolutely, and other people were like, not at all. And based on what people were responding to this, that was explaining disagreements in this value annotation task. So once we generate these kind of highly controversial questions, then when a new post for a new annotator comes in, what we can do is use the GPT fine-tuned model and similarly ask this person all of these questions that we found were very good at explaining disagreements, and then from those features learn new values for that person in particular based on those annotations. So this allows us to calibrate the overall fine-tuned model based on individuals' responses to these questions. Any questions there? Okay, so I'll very briefly show you some evaluation that we did with over 1,000 Americans rating over 5,000 social media posts that were sourced from feeds of real users on a total of over 32,000 ground truth evaluations, or annotations rather. Okay, so our key evaluation measure here is the average Spearman rank correlation. So what that means is, let's take our kind of disability post here. And we're looking at kind of pairwise Spearman rank correlation. So I might have the values that I think are in that post. And then similarly, there might be the values that Anna thinks are in that post. And then we can compute the Spearman rank correlation between our two sets of value annotations for that post. And we can repeat that for each pair of people who are rating this post. And that gives us an overall score of how much are people agreeing or disagreeing with each other in their value annotations. Does that make sense? Cool. So when we do that, we actually find that people kind of disagree with each other. There's low levels of agreement between raters in this task. Another way to think about this is, instead of comparing people to other people, we can compare people to groups of increasing size, wisdom of the crowds. And when you do that, you see that as you increase the group size, you get more consensus with the group overall, which suggests there is some underlying construct here. And so this kind of is our human evaluations, right? This is how well humans do with each other and gives us a benchmark for our automated LLM-based models. So first, when we look at just off-the-shelf GPT, we see that it does a lousy job. People agree with other people more than they agree with GPT. However, when you fine-tune it, you actually get much higher levels of agreement. People agree with this fine-tuned LLM as similar to groups of about size 8 or 9, if you kind of draw the line over. And then finally, when you do this personalization procedure that I talked about before, you see that this is actually the most performant. And people agree with the personalized model more than groups of any size that we observed in our data set. And I'll note here that this pink gap here, the gap between the personalized model and the overall model, is something we're calling a perspectivist gap, right? So, in social science, computational, we're talking about things like toxicity or helpfulness, all these kind of constructs of societal relevance. But a lot of times, what's toxic for me might be different than what's toxic for you. So I think in a lot of tasks, we should be thinking about what is this gap when we're actually calibrating these measures to individuals. That's kind of a side note. Okay, so that kind of wraps up this first chapter of this work on how can we actually measure these values on social media. And now I'm going to turn to the second piece, where we actually take this machinery for measuring values and use it to audit X's in production for UPage algorithm. Okay, so the goal here is to build a systematic view in social media algorithms and their alignment with users' values. So, we saw this Sam Altman tweet, right? That algorithmic feeds are the first at-scale misaligned AIs. And we all here intuitively think that might be true in some way, but it's kind of unclear, at first glance, what that actually really means. So, yeah, there's challenges for assessing the validity here. So on one hand, there's conceptual feasibility problems. So on one hand, we have this notion of what we want the algorithm to care about, these values, so to speak. And on the other hand, we have this observation of the posts that appear in people's feed. And we need to kind of connect these in some principled way that's, at first glance, unclear exactly how to do that. And on the other hand, as far as technical feasibility, these are proprietary ranking algorithms that are black boxes with no accountability or transparency. So people end up relying on folk perceptions and strategization to try to make sense of this. And there is work that actually does look at algorithmic amplification of politics. But this paper in PNAS is actually an internal Twitter team that has access to the whole guts of the algorithm. So the question here is, how do we do this outside of these companies? So the contribution here is how do we actually back out the values that these algorithms are amplifying, and then use that to kind of measure the alignment between this amplification and users' own values. So to do that, we measure algorithmic amplification on X by identifying inventory posts that appear in the For You page feed. So let me break that down a little bit. So if you go to x.com, you'll see that there's these two different tabs here, the For You tab and the Following tab. These are two different feeds. The For You tab is this algorithmically ranked feed that is a collection of both out-of-network content, which is content from people you don't follow, and in-network content, which is content from people you follow. So when we think about all of the posts that could have been put into your feed from out of network, it's a very vast set of content that we know very little about. So this is ultimately pretty hard to reason about. However, for this in-network content, we actually know all of the content that could have been recommended into your algorithmically ranked feed, because all of this content is just the posts that were coming from your following page. Does that make sense? Cool. So to give you kind of a taste of what this looks like, here's a slice of one user in our data set. This is a week of data. In gray here, this is their following page by the number of posts we see. And so you see this kind of day-night cycle of, overall the number of posts in their following feed. And here now in red, what I'll show you is the subset of these posts that we actually were able to identify and match in their algorithmically ranked feed. So these are the posts that actually the algorithm decided to take from the following feed and put into the algorithmically ranked feed. And you'll see that there's this kind of temporal bias here, right, where it's only looking at the last 2 or 3 days. So we have to actually filter our analysis to time windows where we observe non-zero amplification for this to be a valid comparison of these kinds of posts. So ultimately, our kind of measure of algorithmic amplification here is a mixed effects model where we predict whether inventory posts are amplified from the post's expressed values. Okay, cool. So now we have all the pieces to actually see what the values are being amplified, right? We have this machinery for measuring algorithmic amplification, and I'll show you data from 715 Americans, a nationally representative sample on Prolific, over 3 waves of data collection of last fall, where for each user we have about 1.5 thousand posts from their For You page and about 10,000 posts from their in-network inventory. Then we take these about 6.9 million posts, and then we annotate all of them for the values in those posts using this personalized LM infrastructure that I mentioned before. And we also, for these users, collect demographics and their own personal values, so we can look at alignment. And we can also compare this to engagement data too, right? Like what are they actually clicking on and what are their values there? So I'll talk a little bit more about that. We have this data from what these users are actually clicking on in their feeds. Okay, so now I'll show you some results. So here we have our wheel of the 19 values, and I'll show you essentially the beta coefficient of the likelihood, the association between a given value and the likelihood of a post being amplified in your social media post. This is our key pre-registered measure of algorithmic amplification. So what we see is that certain values, in particular these conservation values here in blue, are systematically amplified. So these are things like tradition, rule conformity, interpersonal conformity. We're also seeing that there are other things amplified, like openness to change, self-directed thoughts and actions, kind of over here. And we're also seeing that some post values are demoted. So these are self-transcendent values, such as universal concern and preservation of nature, like climate change content, as well as self-enhancement values, such as power and achievement. So this kind of underscores the kinds of systematic values that are amplified in these algorithms. So what we now can explore is, so okay, there's certain values that go up, that go down, but what does this really mean, right? Like whose values is this really connecting to? So now what we can do is actually compute the value alignment of this. So for each user, we have their individual values, and we can look at the association, the correlation between their own values and the values that are being amplified. So that's this kind of measure here for value alignment. So first, I'm going to show you this in-network inventory. So for each user, looking at the posts in their following feed that's coming from people that they follow, how value aligned is that content? And we see for both Democrats and Republicans that the following feed is pretty aligned with their values. All that content seems pretty supportive of their values. Next, when we look at engagement, the content that those users are clicking on, we see that it's also pretty aligned with their values. And here, maybe it's slightly more value aligned for Democrats than for Republicans. But when we actually look at algorithmic amplification, the results I just showed you on the previous slide, we see that they're dramatically misaligned for both Democrats and Republicans. And what's more, they're dramatically more misaligned for Democrats than they are for Republicans, which is much more than when you ask people what values they think are being amplified. It's even worse than those levels of misalignment. So, okay, what explains this? Why is this happening here, right? We're living in this engagement maximizing social media environment. So I'm going to offer very briefly 2 explanations for this, but also happy to chat about it more after the talk. So the first explanation is heterogeneous engagement, and the second is failure to personalize. So first, starting with heterogeneous types of engagement. On the previous slide, I kind of showed you all the different forms of engagement: clicking, commenting, retweeting, all of that is lumped together. But if we break it out into the different types of ways people are interacting with content, favoriting, retweeting, reply, we see heterogeneity. So here I'll show you the likelihood of engaging, and here's the beta coefficient associated with between a value on a post and the likelihood that someone actually clicks on a post for 24 hours after they've installed our Chrome extension. So when we look at favoriting, which is by and far the most common form of engagement, right? This is 92.8% of events. We see that it's largely value aligned for both Democrats and Republicans. Similar for retweets, and there maybe it's kind of more value aligned for Democrats. However, when we look at replies, which are only 6.8% of our data, we see that replies are dramatically less value aligned and are more value misaligned for Democrats than for Republicans. So this is interesting. If you actually look at the source code for the X's algorithm, this one is out of date at this point, but nevertheless, you see here the model weights on these different forms of predicted engagement. And you see that the algorithm is actually weighting replies 27 times greater than favorites, right? Replies is this really important feature for the algorithm. So despite the fact that this is a small percentage of engagement, it could be the fact that it's kind of playing a disproportionate effect in these algorithms. And in turn, it could actually suggest a feedback loop where Democrats essentially get rage baited, where they see value misaligned content, they engage with it, the algorithm learns from that, gives them more of that content, which they keep engaging with, and that kind of creates this flywheel. So that's one potential explanation for this value misalignment effects. The second is failure to personalize. So here, I'm going to show you more engagement data, but here instead of an individual, should I click on this? Is this piece of content in front of me value aligned? I'm going to show you just the overall number of favorites, retweets, and replies that these posts are getting across the entire platform. And there we see that in general, the values associated with global engagement are less value aligned for those individuals that engage, right? They're kind of less here than over here. And in particular, they're systematically more aligned with Republicans than Democrats. So, we're seeing that these, there's these migrations of people leaving the platform in certain ways, and the algorithm might be learning from these kind of global engagement on the platform, which is leaning towards Republicans. Cool. Okay, so these are two explanations. We can't know for sure what's happening here, but I hope these give you some insight into why this might be happening. So I'll also note, just to close the second piece, is that I showed you a way to measure the alignment between a user and their algorithm. And once you can measure it, this is actually something that you could potentially steer. So in a paper forthcoming in BostonCHI, we actually show that you can re-rank people's feeds for values. So we actually have this Chrome extension that sits on top of Twitter. People can, by a slider, say what their values are. And then in real time, the feed will re-rank their feed of engagement based on algorithms and their values and give them this value line feed. And so there we actually show that users can distinguish between value aligned and engagement aligned rankings, and that they actually do configure these controls that align with their personal values, leading to kind of substantial divergences from these engagement ones. If you're interested in more of this, come see the talk next week. It'll be next Thursday at 9:36 in room 114. Cool. Okay, so this kind of concludes this first piece of the talk, how we can actually use new tools to measure values and then use that to audit existing algorithms in the wild. And now for the last kind of few minutes to close, I'm going to talk about some kind of new and different work, which is kind of exploring algorithmic, the role of algorithms in content production, right? A lot of this work on social media is what kind of content are we consuming? But ultimately, as AI is impacting the way in which people are creating content now more and more, there's this kind of idea of how do we reimagine creative production in the age of AI. And so here, I think we're all seeing, I don't need to belabor this point, of the social cost of AI's impact on creativity. There's large concerns about this taking away creators' jobs, with people putting studios' expansions on hold, and concerns of kind of art theft from the use of people's artwork in training data. And also this kind of proliferation of AI slop, this kind of low quality AI-generated content. This here's a Shrimp Jesus who is kind of proliferating right now on the internet. And this is a challenge because creativity is actually not well understood or instrumented. So we don't really know actually how to change this technology to support human creativity. On a machine side, machines don't actually understand creativity. So if you ask a text image model for a visual portrait of San Francisco, you might get a picture, something like this. Then if you ask for a visual portrait of San Francisco and you tell the model to explicitly be creative, it actually gives you something like this. This is kind of a Van Gogh Starry Night over San Francisco. Van Gogh is great and is also one of the most overrepresented kind of artists in the Western canon. So in a sense, I would say this is kind of backfiring here, right? You ask for something creative and you're getting something fundamentally cliche. So machines don't really have a good sense of what creativity is, but also the literature right now is really struggling to understand that as well. So there's all this concern about how AI homogenization is shaping the world, the rise of algorithmic monoculture, and indeed, people are using these tools to go further faster. And it seems to be coming at the cost of collective diversity. If you look at all of the artifacts being produced, it seems like things are less diverse. But ultimately, these measures of diversity seem to fail to capture the actual kinds of constructs we want, right? We can take pairwise cosine embeddings of embeddings, but does that really capture the kinds of diversity we want in these images? So there's room here to actually be a little bit more precise about what we're talking about when we're talking about creativity. So that's this idea of building a serendipity machine, which I'll talk very briefly about. You can tell it's a little kind of doodly and sketchy, not as well formed as the dome before. That's why it's kind of ongoing work, but I'd love to talk more about. And very briefly, I'm going to talk about 3 ideas for creativity. The first is that it's a social entangled process, which in turn requires kind of weaving these social fabrics in these contexts of AI. That it's also subjective, and in turn requires designing for interpretation primarily. And finally, that it's hard to measure. And I'll show some kind of new ways of measuring creativity going back to the basics. So, starting with this idea of how does sociality impact AI-generated content? To study this, we actually built a platform where people could browse and generate AI-generated hybrid animals. So this is what happens when you blend a goldfish and a golden retriever to get a golden fufa. And we kind of fell in love with this creature and decided to build an entire platform for people to discover their own never-before-seen AI-generated hybrid animals. And on this platform that garnered over 10,000 users, we actually randomized people to these different conditions, these different worlds, little petri dishes, that either had social cues, you could see what other people were clicking on and engaging with, or independent, where all you saw was the animals and you had to kind of engage with them as they were. And essentially what we found is that these social cues were leading to the emergence of diverse local trends. So what this means is here in this plot, we have a dot for each world, and these are the different kind of morphologies of the animals. You can see in the independent world, there's no social cues. You basically get the emergence of dog-like creatures, things that have eyes and a mouth and a nose. Dogs are cute, so if you just let people go, you'll get the evolution of dogs, basically. However, when you have social cues, when you can see what other people are clicking on, you actually see more divergence. People will kind of get more spread out to other kind of more esoteric animals that, in fact, we found are more both divergent and diverse. So this kind of highlights what's at stake when we think about the sociality that mediates this kind of AI slot model that we're increasingly seeing. But ultimately, how are we talking about this, and how is credit assigned to these contexts where AI is involved in production? So we actually ran a study where we actually showed people images of AI-generated artwork and asked them who gets credit for these. Is it the artist who made it? Is it the people in the training data? And we held everything constant, but we systematically varied if the AI was framed as a tool, like a fancy Photoshop, or if it was framed as an agent that had its own creativity in its mind for production. And there we see a pretty systematic trend where when you anthropomorphize the AI, treat it as an agent, it actually undermines credit to the artist who created the artwork and actually bolsters credit and responsibility to the technologist who created it. So this has material consequences for how we frame these technologies and kind of who benefits from them and how we talk about this. So we talk about this in a paper published in Science a few years ago, And ultimately, I think there's a lot of work to do in how we talk about AI in these social media contexts. Some ongoing work is actually building computational measures of attribution in mixed initiative creation. So if you have chat dialogues with people going back and forth with ChatGPT, can you tell which ideas were the humans' ideas that the AI is kind of helping build on? Or is it the fact that the GPT kind of fed them the ideas and the human is kind of rolling with those? So can we actually build computational measures of that? And also, can we actually build interventions that highlight the social relations that are implicit in these kind of models of production? So as far as interpretation, I think this is a really interesting point, kind of going back to the first pillar here. We have a study where we actually had people using generative AI to brainstorm on utopias and kind of future ideas for their community. And interestingly enough, when we showed them imagery, people got a lot of crazy cool ideas from really old glitchy models like VQGAN plus CLIP. When you showed them more kind of recent high polished models, people didn't find them very interesting because they kind of give you what you expect, right? So this just kind of underscores the fact that the glitch is actually kind of the magic of creativity. And these more recent models are really undermining people's capacity to understand that. So in another paper published in CHI, we show actually in context of interpretation here, this is tarot divination, that this kind of sociological theory of resonance, like what is resonating with you, is actually a really good framework for thinking about the indeterminacy and the subjectivity of creative interpretation. So if you're interested in that, you can come see me talk about it next Thursday at 12:27 in room 133. And next steps there, we're thinking a lot about what are the kinds of analogical connections do humans make between phenomenon and what kind of relations they make, and how do machines make connections as well. And this might be a case of homogenization where, if machines are making certain kinds of connections and then feeding those to humans, that might kind of shape the ways in which we are thinking in this kind of thought partnership. So this last piece, before I close, is on challenges for modeling creativity. So it's just really hard to understand and what we're talking about creativity, right? So obviously novelty is something that's prioritized, but novelty relative to what distribution, right? Like we need to always compare to something, and it's not necessarily clear what is the right distribution to compare to. And especially with this data that's very high dimensional, we're thinking about embeddings, right? Like how do we actually compute these in a way where the distances are mapping onto meaningful constructs? So to kind of illustrate this, I'll show you two of the most classically used creativity studies or tasks in the literature. So the first is the alternative uses task, where you give someone an object. So here it's like a cup, and you say, name as many alternative uses for this cup as you possibly can. People just rattle them off. Another is the divergent association task, where I say, give me 10 words that are as different from each other as possible. And people kind of say outlandish things that are disconnected. So in the age of LLMs, like these tasks for measuring creativity completely fall apart and don't make any sense. So for the alternative uses task, fluency, the number of ideas people generate, is like meaningless. Like LLMs can just churn out new ideas for what to use with this, but that doesn't really tell us anything kind of meaningful. And for the divergent association task, AI slop is statistically divergent by its nature, right? It's very far from things that people do. And yet you can write papers where you say, look, AI can generate lots of things, or AI is very divergent, therefore it's creative, right? But clearly that's not capturing the kinds of ideas that we actually want. So we're interested in these kind of new measures of creativity. This is ongoing work where essentially actually creative activity traces of how people are creating over time, multiple iterations, shows people's trajectory through the process of making, not just the products that they're making at the end of the day. And we're interested in these kind of ecologically valid tasks that more closely match the human experience of making. So this is one of my students at MIT who's a figure drawer, and she's really interested in the process of figure drawing over time. And so we're actually running these studies where people are figure drawing, and every time you can see, how do they feel creative in this kind of process. And also connecting tool selection to a subjective experience. So, because the medium and what kinds of tools you're using is such an important part of creativity. And so we're kind of connecting it to things like kind of flow and these kind of subjective measures as well. So I'll close by bringing us back to the House of Commons. So here, Winston Churchill kind of recognized this intuitively, that there's this deep connection between the values that you have, that you put into a building, and the behaviors that you get out of it. And so right now, we're kind of building so much, right? There's so much investment into generative AI and these platforms all around us. But we don't really have good grounding in what are the values that we actually want to instill to these buildings directly. So I'll leave you with this idea that maybe now, if we can start to measure and instrument these things well, then we can start to build new objectives for new buildings that ultimately kind of come together and coalesce and represent the plurality of our different values. So thanks so much, and look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you so much. Now we're open for questions. We can go with the question in the room, then we can go with questions tomorrow.
Sure. So early on, you were talking about the system where people got to rate how accurate they thought what they were looking at was. Now, the current algorithm, which we can all agree is not doing a good job, but it doesn't take any effort on anybody's part except the algorithm. It's measuring what people are already doing.
Mm-hmm.
And what you described, everything you look at, you have to do one more step. And I know that if I were to do that, it would be less than 15 minutes before I got sick of it and would try and find a way around it. So how do you measure something that people don't want to have measured?
I see what you mean. So what I'll say here is that the algorithm is learning from sharing what people engage with. And in that first piece of work, we're letting the algorithm learn from the sharing. But the key idea there is that the flavor of sharing that people are doing in these platforms is a form of sharing that's kind of a distracted, lazy form of sharing. And that's not intentional. It's actually the platforms that are systematically steering people towards a form of sharing that's distracted, that's guided by other things, despite the fact that users themselves say they care about accuracy and they want to be intentional, but the kind of patterns of the platform are steering them another way. So all this is saying is if you remind people of their own values, what they care about, which is in fact accuracy, then they are able to show up for those values better. And so they're still sharing content, maybe slightly less content because they're not clicking on the crazy stuff. But then the algorithm, when it's learning from sharing, it's instead learning from a more intentional, discerning flavor of sharing. So there, ultimately, it's how a light touch design intervention can actually steer the objectives of this algorithm towards what people are actually valuing. Does that make sense?
Can you get them to think about how accurate this is without actually answering the question?
That's right. Once they're thinking about it, then the engagement that the algorithm is learning from is like a thoughtful, kind of intentional form of sharing. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Amazing talk. I wanted to look into, maybe you can comment on this notion of consensus for assigning labels.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of these approaches where you specifically train a system with divergent labels
Mm-hmm.
that have contradictions, hoping or like
Interesting.
the goal that the system learns to distinguish different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super cool. I like that idea a lot. I'm maybe not super familiar with those kind of approaches, but I do think that there's a lot of benefit in kind of looking at the plurality of possibility and designing for that. I think a lot of kind of classical tasks assume that there's a singular ground truth that you can just get to, and you just average large groups of people and you get there. But I think exactly what you're saying highlights the point that you might have a plurality of opinions that are all kind of diverging, and having systems that are flexible to that instead of collapsing over that difference, actually explicitly model that is, I think, like a super interesting and important direction. And we highlight one way to do that. But I think, again, it's kind of a whole design space of a kind of a plurality of opinions that you can kind of model. And, what kinds of demographics and individual differences are explaining differences in value elicitation or these constructs. I think there's a whole science there of understanding where these divergences come from, and how do they kind of, where do they go, basically. So, I think it's like interesting future work. Yeah.
So, the question that was asked earlier about when the person is looking at something and looking at a post on a social media and determining, like, is this accurate or not? Explain to me how, I suppose that your design intervention isn't going to be that every time a person is going to share, you ask them, do you think this is accurate or not? Can you explain to me the mechanism by which you sort of like work around that so that the user doesn't have to do any extra labor?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you described, where every single time they click share, it's like, hey, like, do you think this is accurate? That, I would say, is like the most extreme version of the intervention, where you're really kind of being very onerous in that. A much lighter touch that you can do, which is exactly what we did in the Twitter field experiment, is you send someone a small DM that says, hey, here's a post. Do you think it's accurate? And they're accurate is big, bold, red, underlined. And there, they have their whole browsing experience. And then for one moment, they open the DM and see one single headline and one question of if it's accurate. And there, we don't even really care if they like respond to the message and rate it. It's just the fact that at one moment in their browsing session, they were like thinking about accuracy. And then they go back to scrolling. And the idea is that just thinking about accuracy for one moment is enough to actually shift your mindset and your attention to make the construct of accuracy salient. So the idea is actually spills over into downstream sharing decisions. There is, of course, the idea that like if you have these things, is it accurate? After a while, there's this idea of banner blindness where you just kind of like breeze over it and forget about it. So in one of these papers, we actually show that there's a whole kind of toolkit of different accuracy prompts that work. So another one is just saying kind of a more of a PSA that's like, did you know that 87% of Americans think it's highly important to think about accuracy? There, it's not like, here's a headline, is it accurate? It's more this kind of general sentiment. And so there's this whole kind of range of different ways to prompt accuracy. And if you carousel through all of those, that's one potential way to kind of mitigate this banner blindness. But ultimately, it does introduce friction, right? Because you're getting people to think more. So that's kind of a fundamental piece of it. Yeah.
Thanks, Ziv. So when I first read the title for the talk with the attention machine, what came to my mind was the transformer architecture. So like now I'm in the talk and it's like it could be different synopsis, but I'm going to work off of that because I see they seem to like metaphors.
Love it.
And so with the transformer architecture, it has parallel compute, so it's efficient, but there is like this complexity to it using lots of data and compute to sort of like do those calculations. And in that sense, like you reinvent attention itself in the architecture, and you're reinventing attention here too. But in terms of like you're looking at values, but you use attention because it's the attention economy, it's what you see in like your feed. But is there other ways or words or framings that can also be where it's because I feel like there's a lot of work in values here, and attention feels like it's working on that perspective.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I love it. Attention is all you need, but maybe it's a different kind of attention, right? So I think there's so much deep questioning here about the connection between attention and values. I think the way I think about it is like with the accuracy prompts, we have an example where people care about accuracy. They care about sharing what is true. And you could ask why they care about it. There's a whole, you could get into the cognitive science of it, but ultimately people have a value. But then when they show up to social media, they're distracted, right? The casino is distracting them away from their values, and then they act in value misaligned ways. But that's just accuracy, right? I think this is true for a lot of us in a lot of settings where we have a lot of values that we believe to be true, but it's just like the architecture and the environments around us distract us from our own values. So the idea here is how can we actually design systems that pay attention to people's values and help us show up to our own values in a way that allows for kind of value-aligned behavior. So I think there's a lot of interesting both system building and kind of cognitive science that explicitly connects values and attention in this way. I hope that helps a little bit. Yeah, over here.
So you mentioned this paper that you collaborated on where you kind of had this Google extension and individuals can kind of rate their different perspectives or their values, and that kind of helps craft the algorithm for them. So I think an obvious problem that comes to my mind, and I don't know if this was addressed in the paper, is how does this prevent against these kind of echo chambers on these kind of social media platforms where similar people that have maybe the similar political perspectives and stuff, they kind of have these same aligned values, and that can lead to some problems?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic question. Thank you for it. So that is, I think, one like failure mode of this kind of research is, yeah, maybe it's like, it sounds good to kind of get value line feeds, but do just lead to value echo chambers where everyone has their own values and they live in the little world with all the other people with the same values. And I think that is like a super kind of top of mind for me, like concern. And I think we need more research to really understand to what extent that's actually true. One thing I'll say that actually made me excited to work on this instead of scared is this idea of if we actually have this machinery for detecting and eliciting values and it's kind of working in some way, then that might actually allow us to identify bridging values. These are values that actually people across the echo chamber from different partisan aisles actually like agree on. And then if we can identify these bridging values, then maybe that could be this way to kind of systematically amplify conversations that are bridging and kind of supporting constructive conversations more. But ultimately, the extent to which value-aligned feeds lead to value echo chambers, the extent to which we can identify and amplify bridging values, that's all like super interesting future research that we should definitely do. Yeah. Over here.
Great, fantastic talk.
Thank you.
I don't know if you could talk a little bit about how you're thinking about like credit attribution for creativity. For example, are you imagining that in the future, even like the data annotators would be considered, like the prompt engineer would also be considered? Like, how are you thinking about that future based on your research?
It's a really good question. Yeah, I can say a few things. I think, so one is very much based on the research we've done, we have shown that how you talk about AI changes how we think about the material conditions of this being created. So there's this kind of Marxist idea of commodity fetishization, where when you have a commodity good, you kind of ignore the social relations that went into creating it. You just see it as a commodity good. And I think that's happening with generative AI content. So I think that there's a lot of interesting work on labels, on interfaces that actually de-fetishize the content and kind of lay bare and reveal the social relations that made that. And I think that can kind of help change how people are conceptualizing this. I think there's a lot of invisibilizing that is happening right now that hopefully some of that work can explore. I also think that at the same time, there's interesting work on like how do we measure an individual input to a system, whether or not that's a piece of an image in the training data or one creative output among many, and actually looking at these individual level metrics for attribution and seeing what is the kind of relative information gain that a given artifact is increasing this overall aggregate measure of diversity. And so I think there's actually interesting kind of theory and computational questions of what are these kind of item level measures of creativity or diversity that kind of allow for a more interpretable kind of understanding of attribution. So maybe that's like a few initial steps in that direction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I had two questions. One was a little bit more curiosity about your, I think you called it personalization, which had a bunch of annotation data. I also saw on one of the other slides, you said something about having kind of personal characteristics of the people as well. What kinds of things were you keeping in mind for that?
Yeah, totally. So there, just to kind of do these analyses, like, partisan differences and value alignment, we do look at people's partisanship. We do kind of standard demographics, age, gender, ethnicity, region, and then also they're like personal values, right? So what are people actually valuing? And then separately, we ask them this series of calibration questions. So these are these items that we found were maximally explaining disagreements in value annotations. So we ask every single person all of those questions, which allows us to calibrate the model to that particular person. And you might think, just feed all of that data into the model that's doing this personalization. But a key kind of value of ours in this kind of audit is a procedural legitimacy. And I think if you have this kind of very sensitive personal data going into the system that's giving you this personalization, that like maybe isn't great. And we actually found that these features that are just, getting the nice plates out for the holidays, these kind of items that are really about values, were as useful as any of this demographic information. So you don't actually need to use any of that information to get a performant model that is kind of personalizing and tailoring these value annotations.
Interesting. So do you think they performed at a similar level then? Or do you think that
They outperform the demographics.
Oh, okay, they did.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But I think, again, there's a lot of interesting questions of like what demographics are shaping these and to what extent. And, I think there's like more like interesting social science questions that come outside of this for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Over here.
When I think about like reinventing the attention machine, I think about like the participation of the companies that build these algorithms. And I think my concern is that like, do you think that it's possible that some of these values, when we come to these social media things, they will actually decrease our engagement? Because I think about like how effective rage baiting is for keeping someone on the platform for long hours. That like it might result in these companies not actually investing in these kind of algorithms in the first place, which it's like, then what's the point? It's like, do we just sit around and wait for companies to hope to care about these things? Like, what do you think is the next steps in that area?
Absolutely. Another fantastic question. So I think here it's important to note that, for example, the accuracy prompts, those decrease engagement because people are just clicking on sketchy stuff less. And so that is hard for a Meta, for a TikTok to swallow because of their kind of core business logics. And that's actually why I moved to California to try with these value aligned feeds, because this is actually a group of like 8 Stanford faculty who meet every week and are talking to all the people in Silicon Valley, like the product and product manager on the like feed algorithm team on various companies, to really look at like what does systems change look like in their organization. And there, one of the big reasons that they optimize for engagement is because engagement is easy to measure. It's just right in front of you, so like why not? But ultimately, people within these companies realize that this is also not a great overall situation. In other words, there might be slack in the system where when you optimize for this thing, you kind of get some local minimum in like the search space of objectives. And any kind of like, would you tweak it this way to be that way? You're kind of just stuck in the swamp of like myopic engagement maximization. So the idea of actually, if we could like instrument and measure people's values, that might allow us to hop to a different place in that parameter space where people are actually maybe even more engaged. They're connecting to content and communities that they are really aligned with and excited about. And so the interaction with the platform, instead of just kind of passively absorbing slop, is instead of a more kind of like active long-term form of engagement. And so I'm not saying that, that is even necessarily true, but I think it points to a way of a kind of like empirically based way to optimize for more long-term outcomes that is actually supporting users and therefore also supporting companies. But ultimately, more work is needed to understand exactly how that fits. Yeah.
I have a question. So basically, if you take a look at the current social media platforms, there's like a lot of AI bots and AI frauders that are available. Now, definitely, this is a controlled experiment with just human subjects. But if we are going to use this theory on application in a social media platform, like how do we filter out AI bot interactions and crawler interactions?
That's right. Yeah, I think it's super important, and these platforms are increasingly becoming mediated by AI work. So at least in the field experiment we ran, we did, at the time it was like bot or not is like standard detection technology. It's getting harder and harder. It's kind of an arms race to actually detect these things. So I think that's just kind of a fundamental inevitability of these systems. But I think one thing that's nice about this is that it is kind of safeguarding individuals' capacities and kind of relying on the social science versus techniques that are trying to kind of top down kind of regulate or like control speech. And there are like really interesting things like community notes and these and kind of crowdsourced fact checking where you could like kind of randomly pick on a subset of users. So that way you don't get this kind of like astroturfing where you have like large swarms of bots that are kind of interacting with that. So those are some like initial ideas, but ultimately I think it's a large challenge and we need to like think very hard about this. Absolutely. Any other questions? Yeah, back here.
I'm curious on your work on creativity, which is what you mentioned. I also research creativity, so I've got lots of questions there.
That's right.
So you have it as like the basement of your tower. So I'm curious about the relationship and the questions you interrogate there, because is it sort of like feels as if now it's like there's two different research interests that you have, and that's, or are you planning on joining? And that's also because creativity also entails a study of values, right? I think this one entails a bit of like a bottom-up study of values, and then how do you design systems from there.
That's right.
So curious how those two blend together and what differences they are.
Yeah, I think I'm still exploring this. I think that I don't see it as like the basement of the tower. I see it as like a new tower. And I think that there are these kind of core questions like how do we measure things? How do we align kind of systems with users' values that I think transcend context? So I think with social media and misinformation and feed algorithms, there's this core things of how do we handle difference? How do we personalize? How do we, shift attention? And then I think for me, it was like, oh, these exact same tools are super related for this kind of new one. So for the attention machine of like social media algorithms, that is kind of like, for me, the dome with these like pillars. And the second one is maybe more like a Guggenheim or like an art museum that also has these kind of pillars. And I think it's just as these new kind of societally important constructs come out, like creativity, we don't really know what that is. How do we measure it? So I think a lot of the social science can come and really inform the way that we understand these things. So I'm excited to kind of increasingly explore that on the creativity side as I think it becomes more and more important. Cool. Great. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Just one question.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So this question is about how do we define the value of an algorithm should. I'm going to rephrase the question. How do we define the value of an algorithm should care about why we need algorithm itself to enforce them? So kind of like using, like why should certain values be part of that algorithm? How do
Yeah, so it's a good question. I will note that like there's no such thing as a value neutral algorithm. The algorithms today have values explicitly in them, right? And that's the techno-feudalism. There just happen to be a set of values that are the ones that are being amplified. Those are very systematically picked by a certain set of people. So I think the vision here is who should pick those? If we can measurably identify that certain values are in fact being amplified, it raises the fundamental question of who should be the ones to pick that. And then I think that opens up a lot of really interesting kind of social choice and policy questions that ultimately I believe should maybe go to the end users. And there you could do users picking their own values, but I'm also increasingly interested in community values. So what does it actually look like to join a community that has a set of values and then maybe building the values that are kind of being fed into the algorithm. So I think the values are multi-scale. There's individual personal values, community values, and kind of like societal or collective values. And I think we need to design actually on all three of the layers of that stack. So thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
Cool.